think. Let me run through the preamble and that kind of thing, and then during the demo, if you have questions, let's go for it, because I'm going to try and do some stuff live, so sort of pray to the demo gods, but I'm quite happy if we just want to go off-piste and try some things as well. If you have questions as we go, let's do that. But yeah, otherwise, let's get into it. So, quick intro about myself. So my name is Lou. Yep, I'm a PM at Gitpod. Worked previously as sort of software engineer. And yes, I like to hang out in the community as well. So after the session, if you want to chat, if you want to find me on Discord, feel free to. If you want to tag me and stuff, for sure, do it. It's always interesting to hear sort of feedback and stories from users as well. So let's continue the conversation after this as well. Okay, so I will demystify what we're talking about when I say in a loop in just a second, but just in terms of the agenda, so I will go through a little bit of a what and a why about this feature, what it is, why we've built it, and what we, and then we've come in here to discuss it with you. I'll do a quick demo, show you in the flesh how it actually works, actually have a play around with it, and then talk about sort of what's next for the feature itself, and then get some of your feedback and thoughts as well, if you have them. So, mandatory disclaimer before I get into it is kind of here be dragons. So the feature that I'm going to show you is actually currently in beta. So what that means is the documentation for it is very limited currently. We're working on that. There is some stuff going on in the background, but there isn't anything in our actual live production documentation. There's a little bit of a mention about the feature, but not too much. And then also the naming is something that quite possibly will change. And there's a slide about this later on where I'm very curious as well about your input and thoughts there as well. Obviously, naming is one of the most difficult things, so certainly would like your feedback and thoughts on that. And quickly, one last thing before I do get into it, as I just want to throw up actually some faces of some of the different Gitpodders and even people in the community that have been involved with this feature. It's important really because I think some of them might be able to join today, but a lot of these things takes a lot of engineering impact as well, and some of our engineers aren't here to kind of talk through some stuff, but and then also people in DevRel, sort of our CPO, CTO, but then also the community. This is a really important thing. I think sometimes because we have this community and you put stuff on GitHub, it kind of feels like sometimes that maybe like it's difficult to get back to all the issues. I think we have thousands now. So sometimes getting back to all the comments and actually actioning all the issues takes a bit of time. But for today's topic, I'm actually super excited because it is a very, very well requested feature from the community. We have so many issues specifically on this topic. So Andrew Brown is one of our community heroes, has raised something similar, asking for a way that you could rebuild workflows using VS Code. David is also one of our community heroes as well. Was also asking for sort of, could we have a way of doing checkup or doctor within our GP command line as well within Gitpod. So this is very cool. So it's just another one to reinforce. Please, we love your feedback in GitHub issues, and please continue the conversation. We do listen to them. We really do, and then we act on them, and then we get to come here and do demos and ask you for your feedback as well. And we're doing this as well. This is beta, so it's a little bit pre to the GA. So any feedback as well. It's always nice to get your input as well before we put things out fully into production and fully into general availability as well. But alas, enough preamble. So I mentioned the inner loop. So I should probably talk about that. What actually is the inner loop? We talked about this a lot we talked about the inner loop a lot internally in Gitpod, and a lot of people started then asking, well, what is the inner loop? So let me just clarify what I'm talking about here. So when people talk about inner loop, they're typically talking about sort of general developer experience more broadly than this specific feature that I'm going to show you today. So when we say inner loop, we're often talking about everything that happens sort of pre-commit. So when you're writing code, building code, testing code, and that's typically done on your local machine or on your laptop. And then everything that happens beyond that, once you commit, test, deploy, that kind of thing, then that is often sometimes called the outer loop. Now, the interesting thing about Gitpod is we operate in both of those spaces. So you can code within Gitpod. So there is a sort of inner loop that you will build within Gitpod, and also Gitpod itself has a sort of inner loop. But then we also have an outer loop as well, which comes post-commit, which is pre-builds and image builds and everything that happens after you commit in Gitpod as well. And I went out and I stole this image from the internet if you're a visual person. And this is basically how the inner and outer loop looks as well. So this is what I'm talking about with when I say inner and outer loop. But yeah, so what are we looking at and why are we looking at it? So over the course of the last year or two, speaking with lots of users and watching them using Gitpod in general, I've come to realize that as people start to wrap their head around what Gitpod does and kind of their learning journey within Gitpod, it tends to follow these sort of 4 steps, which tend to be, the first one is people realizing that Gitpod allows you to code in the cloud. They open a workspace, they sign up for Gitpod, they end up maybe in VS Code or something like this, and then they go, okay, cool, like this is interesting. This is like an online editor, like there's code running in the cloud. But then immediately people's first question beyond that is usually like, okay, but if they're not into VS Code, they sort of go, okay, how can I bring my own stuff? How, can I use my own editor for this? Does this work on desktop? Can I work in Vim? Can I SSH into this? And then they start to discover those bits. And that's kind of like the second epiphany that I tend to see people go through. But it's more than that, right? Because then they get to that point and they kind of go, okay, there's code in the cloud, that's cool. I can bring my own editor, but why? What does this bring me? And that's when the sort of the configuration side of Gitpod comes in, which is the Gitpod YAML, pre-builds, and all that kind of stuff that enables actually the value of Gitpod beyond that. Because up until that point, you're coding in the cloud, you've got your own editor, but that's the same as your local machine. So why would you want to do that? But then at that point, I think is really where things get interesting, because you start to realize that things can be repeatable. You can have multiple workspaces at the same time. And then you can really lean into the sort of ephemeral side of Gitpod as well, having as many workspaces as you want, throwing them away. And that step 3 is actually the part that largely we'll focus on today, which is how do we get our users to get to that point where they are configuring as much as possible, and that configuration experience is as simple and easy as possible, so that we can kind of take our users through this journey all the way through these steps. And then beyond that is when users kind of discover that, Gitpod is a collaborative platform. So bring your own teams, work together, collaborate on your configurations, and you start to understand things like previews and snapshots and that kind of thing. But yes, I did have a quick question for you before I go on to my next slide and then quickly onto the demo. But I'm just curious. So for the people that have actually used Gitpod today, I'm kind of curious as well. What is your current loop for testing configuration changes in Gitpod? So let's say today you want to go and update a project that you're working on. I'm kind of curious. What do? You go to update your Gitpod YAML, but then what next? Like, how do you personally test that? Now, I don't want to bias too much, but let's see what people answer in the chat, and then we'll go from there. I'll give you a minute or two if you want to drop any answers in there. I'm kind of curious. Otherwise, I can prompt you with some ideas, but I don't want to bias too much. And I'm also showing my whole screen, so I'm going to have to jump back in here. Let me make this bigger so you're not looking at yourself too much. Several people are typing. Okay, I'll leave you to do that. Have a look. Let's have a look. many manual labor. No testing as of now. Trial and error. Okay. Push changes to a bounce, paste URL with gitpod.io prepended and wait for the container to build. I follow this learn Gitpod page so far recently. No more. Trial and error. Yeah. Hope and pray. The hope and pray strategy. There's a time I often watch developers when they're coding away and they'll change like 100 lines of code and then like build and run, and this like scares me deeply. I'm kind of like a TDD kind of person. Like I want to make sure stuff's running. So Ghost says make change, close workspace, press Gitpod button on repo, wait 5 years for my files to rerun. I've destroyed the environment, await container. Okay. Okay, so lots of different options. Okay, cool. So it probably then looks some sort of variation of this, right? So you have a workspace in some case, and then you restart another workspace based off that configuration. For a lot of people that I've watched doing this, a lot of people have the Chrome extension installed, and they'll typically go back to GitHub, go back to the branch or the commit that they're working from, click on that, start a new workspace, check the configuration, and then go back to that. Now, some people as well, some people keep the same workspace there, they stop it and they start a new one and they keep one tab open, and some people like this idea of like 2 tabs. But I've seen multiple variations of it. But yes, the challenge is really with that flow, and I think some people already alluded to it, the sort of the hope and pray strategy. Well, for starters, it takes many clicks. And in many cases, it means that you actually leave Gitpod. Now, one thing that's really cool about Gitpod with the things like the Chrome extension is it integrates then where you're doing your code in GitHub. But then once you've got a workspace open, it's kind of weird to then have to keep bouncing back to GitHub or somewhere else to go back to your browser and add a new URL. And then lastly, I think one of the biggest difficulties with this as well is that you also need to commit. So it might be that your configuration you aren't happy with, maybe you're pushing to a repository that's related to your work, or there was some reason that you don't want to commit, or also as well, like it just takes extra time to go through that commit cycle to push something. And we all know the first few commits are like super neat and super well described, and eventually it just gets down into the like, please work, and then you're just committing the same thing, just hoping that things work as well, which then it kind of negates the whole point of committing in the first place, because they're meaningless, right? And then you have to squash it later and that kind of thing. So yeah, so what we're talking about here is really shifting left that configuration of workspaces. So what we've been trying to do is take everything that happens post-commit, or as much as things that happen post-commit right now in Gitpod, and then bring them pre. So avoid the need to commit and get sort of feedback as soon as possible in the flow, rather than having to wait for new workspace builds and things like that. But I've talked a lot, and maybe you're feeling a bit like this, that you just want to be shown what I'm talking about here rather than talking about it. So let me just jump straight in and go ahead and we'll do some demo. I will just check quickly. Please work, yeah. My goodness, yeah, I've just got into the habit as well. I feel like a shell script that just auto commits the same message at this point. Cool, so let me give you a run through. So I thought about different ways of demoing this and running through this with you today, but what I want to do is actually do this from scratch. Pretend that we're sort of Gitpodifying an example repo. And as I go through this, if you want, feel free to drop things in the message as well if you want, or ask a question as well as I go through. So I've got a pretty blank repo here. In fact, you know what I'm going to do? I'm actually going to delete entirely my Gitpod YAML as well. So we just go back to the README, very basic empty repo. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you to this new command. So in all of the workspaces right now, I hope that's big enough. I'll go a little bit bigger as well. We have a command on the GP CLI called GP rebuild. Now, GP is included in all workspaces by default and has a bunch of different helper tasks for different things that you can do inside of Gitpod if you didn't already know. So we've introduced this new command called GP rebuild to help you out when it comes to configuring your workspace. So given that I've got no Gitpod YAML in here right now, I'm going to go ahead and create one. An interesting thing about this workflow now is also that we have an opportunity to lint, provide validation, and also nudge you as well if you do things incorrect. So one thing that's quite common as well is just misspelling the Gitpod YAML. It's really easy to do. But then you maybe go to commit, you restart your workspace, think maybe things don't apply. And if you're not super familiar with Gitpod, it might be easy to overlook that kind of thing. So now with this command and this workflow, when you're going back here and rerunning rebuild, then we have an opportunity to nudge you. Now at the moment, we don't do a full extensive validation of every different edge case, but we have validation for a lot of different common scenarios that you might bump into as you're configuring your repository. So right now, I'm getting the same message because I haven't added a dot in front of my .gitpod YAML. So I'm going to go ahead and add that and then run my little GP rebuild command again. Now I need to configure my Gitpod YAML. Okay, so I need to add something to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and add let's add a basic task in here, and I'm just going to do an npm install. So let me add a command, and I'm going to add npm install. So what I'm saying here is that I want to do an npm install when I start my repository, and I'm actually just going to run. Okay, I don't have npm. Okay, let's go with this because we can fix this problem. So I'm going to add npm install in there and say that when I start this workspace, I actually want to install any npm modules into my workspace. So now let's go ahead and run a GP rebuild and see what we get this time. Now, before the session, I did actually already run the GP rebuild command. So there is a little bit of caching that's already in place there. But what it's essentially done is now it's actually rebuilt my workspace itself, and it rebuilds this currently within the current workspace. And what it does is it emulates a workspace start, but inside your actual current workspace, rather than forcing you to commit, leave, and that kind of thing. So what I would get is I get a bit of command output. If I'm building my image, I get the same thing that you see with like a Docker build, which is get all the build output. It will pull all your images, put them in cache, and then start a workspace. And then what you get is this output, which kind of looks a bit groovy if I zoom in, but I think probably easier to read. And basically what it tells me is that I've got now a new workspace running at this URL, and it also gives me an SSH output. So I'm going to ignore the SSH for now and then just open this one, and what it's going to do is essentially then it's going to give me a new workspace that started immediately. Now I would do the typical things that I would usually do when opening the workspace, check if everything works. And then straight away, so we've got a task created, which is what we asked for, an npm install, but then what's the error? Whereas in here, I assume it's telling me that npm doesn't exist. And it's now complaining about my package.json. And here we go. We're kicking off the journey of adding in different configurations and then retesting, which is very typical, like day-to-day kind of loops that you'd be doing as a developer. Okay, wonderful. I've forgotten something. Package.json does not exist. So let's go ahead and add that. I'm not sure actually of the standard for package.json, which properties I need, but let's find out. So what I can do is I can cancel that command. That then stops that workspace, hit GP rebuild again, and then it will create me a new workspace. Now you can see obviously considerably quicker. Obviously the reason for that is because we're able to cache very aggressively a lot of those, the images and things that you need in your workspace, so that we can start a new one very quickly after that, which is considerably quicker than committing, pushing, and then restarting a new space inside of Gitpod. And also it's quite nice because you don't have to leave. Cool, so I've opened that up and okay, so I just learned today as well that package.json has absolutely no schema that it needs, and it will do an install with no properties whatsoever. So there you go. So that's that. I've done my npm install inside of my Gitpod YAML. So let me think, what can I do now? What I'm going to do is, so if we look at the log output here, basically this is saying this is using workspace full. You might not know, but if you don't define an image configuration within Gitpod, we basically base your workspace on this workspace full. But this is kind of like a kitchen sink image, and it includes a lot of stuff that you might need when you're first getting started, but ultimately might not. And oftentimes what we do is we will encourage users to change this, because then you can pin to specific versions that you need, and also you can thin that out. Generally speaking, it's nice to have an image that that you can build very quickly and doesn't have a lot of fluff in it that you need. Reduces your sort of general attack surface from a security standpoint, makes things more performant, and generally is a nice practice. But within Gitpod, we do that for you automatically, but you might not know. So this is one thing as well within the GP rebuild command, that we can start to nudge different users as well and start to suggest, hey, maybe you want to use this type of image, or maybe you want to do this, or did you know that your image is this big and maybe you should make it smaller, or you're using all these tools, but maybe you don't need them. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and add an image in here. So I'm going to add a separate one, and I'm going to say, let's use Gitpod, instead of workspace full, let's use workspace base, which is a slimmed down version of the default workspace image, which has a few less tools installed. And again, so we're going to cancel, and then we're going to run GP rebuild. Now I don't think, so a lot of my Docker images are already cached, so that's going to start for me immediately. I'm going to go back through and then open a new workspace, and then let's see what happens this time. Now, if I remember correctly, if the demo gods are with me today, I don't think npm is actually installed in workspace base. So there we go. So what I get is another error for npm command not found. And again, we're just going through this typical loop that you'll often go through day to day. But obviously, what I'm hoping that you're starting to see is this considerably faster than the option of committing through. We haven't committed at all whatsoever here. And because we've got those caches, it's able to go through these new workspaces much, much quicker than if you're creating new workspaces. So I'm going to go ahead and cancel that. Now, because we don't have npm installed on workspace base, what I'm actually going to do to resolve that is I'm going to create my own custom Docker file. So I'm going to reference a file, and then I'm going to say gitpod.dockerfile. This is a general standard that most people use, but you don't have to. You can actually reference any file. I don't know if people knew that, but I think it's sometimes easy to think that just because we name it .gitpod.dockerfile that it has to be named that way, but it doesn't. And I'm going to go ahead here and bring through that base image. So rather than using the hosted base image, I'm actually going to take my own base image here as well. And then I'm going to add to it two commands that I wrote down earlier because I won't remember them to actually install npm onto that. So I'm going to take the base image as it is, and then now I'm going to tailor it for the actual tools that I actually want in this particular scenario. So let's go back, save both those files, and and then do another GP rebuild. Now again, this is more Docker magic because we're using the same base image. So a lot of this is already cached for us and pulls up quite quickly. So let's go through, have another look at our new workspace, and hopefully this time, because we've now added npm, that we actually get back to a successful message. And there we go. So that looks correct to me. So it's running npm install inside my workspace. It's slightly different log output because I think I'm using a different version of npm that I've installed between the versions, or a different version of Node. I'm not quite sure, but that is now running cleanly because I now have the required tools I need in my workspace. So now I could certainly go further and I can keep doing this, but I think hopefully you're getting the point at this point about what the tool does. Let me just double check in Slack if you have any questions to answer. If we got some questions, maybe I'll get back to that in a second. Okay, cool. So let's have a look at some of these questions and maybe answer some of these as well. So what do we got?
I could read them out for you, Lou, if that makes it easier.
Yeah, there's a lot of excited emojis going on in here. So
yeah, there was mostly chatter, but
sift through. That would help me out, Pauline. And then maybe actually I can show people if they have questions, and we can actually do it live.
Yeah. So can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay, cool. So Shal has asked, does workspace base load faster than workspace full? In the past, workspace full was the fastest image to load, and even that was huge.
It's a good question. So we typically obviously will just cache. It's typical caching strategy. We'll cache the things that are the most frequent for us, and that is typically workspace full or layers within workspace full. There's no reason necessarily that workspace base wouldn't load quicker. This is something that we're also looking into now, because with this new command, we have the opportunity to nudge users towards different images as well. And we're having to think about how we ultimately as well improve the performance for workspace loading. But generally speaking, having a lighter weight image that's going to be quicker to build is going to make sense. And then also, if you're pre-building that as well, it's going to naturally be quicker to pre-build if it's a smaller image rather than larger. We also have potentially have some Gitpod engineers on the call as well. I don't know if they wanted to jump in as well and provide a more engineering related answer to the question, but if not, we can always jump to the next one.
Yeah, I think Anton might have jumped in actually, but Shal, I can see that you're in the call. If you want to unmute and add to that question, then feel free to. Otherwise, feel free just to type in the chat. It's nice to see you, by the way.
Great. Thank you.
Okay,
It's good
cool.
to be here.
Yeah,
I had an additional question. I put it in the chat.
Yeah. Cool. Awesome. So the other question we have is from Sky. Are there any workspaces that are bleeding edge, specifically ones that immediately update to LTS when a tool goes LTS? For example, Node.js, Ubuntu, etc.
That's a good question about the workspace image cycle itself. So I believe so. Currently the managed workspace images, I think we update roughly every week, and they often go to latest. It depends on what it is. If it's a patch update, I think we typically will roll those out weekly. If it's sort of a major change, then we're also then publishing that in the change log before we update that. You can pin to specific tags the versions of the workspace, the images that we have, the managed images, to kind of stick so you don't get any breakages. However, then obviously you'll have to manage that yourself and do your updates. It really comes down to what workflow you want, because you can use by using the default ones, then yes, you're going to get any bumps and version updates, which potentially could break stuff, but it depends on your workflow. If you want to tag that and then manage that yourself, you can do. If it's sort of a personal project you're running, maybe you just want to use the generic base image, accept the updates, and then if then you need to do any updates on your side, then you can do that as well. Or you can set up your own image and manage all those different versions yourself. It kind of depends on sort of your own personal setup and your own requirements. Like obviously for a lot of companies, they'll get more sophisticated with this. They might even centrally manage those images, scan them, run them through security before they update them, harden them as well. But it kind of depends. But our workflow is we update roughly every week to those images. And if you go on Docker Hub as well, because that's where they're published, you can see all the different tags and you can grab some of the different versions as well if you want to pin to a specific one.
Nice. Hopefully that's answered your question, Sky. Feel free to add a follow-up if you have any more questions. We've got another question. What happens when you add pre-build tasks when using the new GP rebuild? Very good question.
Yes, it's a good question, because I was thinking as we asked these that I hadn't showed another feature of the GP rebuild. Yeah, so let's go ahead and do this actually. So it's one thing that we've been exploring as well is different permutations of the GP rebuild to create different states within Gitpod. Because when you do a pre-build, we run different commands in different states. Obviously, when you run the pre-build, it runs some init commands, it runs your before commands and prepares your workspace before loading it and then starting it. However, there are different scenarios because you can start a workspace from a pre-build, or you can start a workspace basically as a pre-build. And today it's very difficult actually as well to debug pre-build specifically. So that's one thing that we've also added as a flag to the command, and you can actually, let me show you how this works. So let me go ahead and actually update this. So I'm just going to, let's change this. So let's pretend we have an application or a node application here. And this is not going to do anything particularly interesting, but just emit hello world. And then what I'm going to do is, if you're familiar with Gitpod, what this basically means is every time your workspace starts, you're now going to do an install, and then you're going to start your application. That's fine for small things, but you might want to leverage pre-builds and optimize your commands by pushing off maybe the npm install into an init command. Now, init runs during pre-build, and then command runs on workspace start. If you don't have pre-build configured, Gitpod basically just runs through the whole thing, and it won't run it as a pre-build. It'll just run it in front of you, sort of in this like headed mode as well. Now, when you run GP rebuild by default, it kind of just respects those semantics. So what we've seen previously, if I just run the regular GP rebuild command now, what it's going to do is actually just run both of those commands. So if I open this up, I'm expecting it to see it actually doing that npm install and then emitting the hello world from the command as well, which isn't particularly interesting, but I can show you some other permutations after. So yeah, again, we get the npm install, and then we get the Node.js command band as a follow-up, and we get a hello world. But let's say if you wanted to debug a pre-build itself, so let's say you're iterating on these init commands, and let's say, I don't know, maybe you run a pre-build one day and it's broken for some reason, or something's not as expected. Maybe some version is updated, or something's going wrong and you're getting error messages. And what you can do is also run GP rebuild, and then we have a pre-build flag. And what this basically does is it runs exactly the same setup that we would run for a pre-build, but runs it in your workspace and then creates this this new workspace based on that. So what it will do is it'll run the init commands, the exact same stuff that we run, the Gitpod runs in a pre-build, but it runs it in your actual workspace. So if you've got some sort of error or setup and you want to kind of pause the workspace load after the pre-build start, you can actually do that as well. So if I open that up, what we'll see is it will run the npm install, that kind of init command that would be run as your pre-build, but it pauses before it gets to the actual command step. So then you can sort of pause that state as if it was a pre-build, and then dig around in there and start to look at some of the error messages and figure out what's potentially going wrong. So that's run that. Now, I hesitate to mention this a little bit because we're still thinking through some of the naming for this as well, but we do have some other commands in here as well, which I won't show in too much detail. Oops, sorry, I wanted to get the help text actually, not to run it. Which is, yes, we also have these from commands as well, which we're also experimenting with. So what this allows you to do is the previous command, the pre-build one, runs basically a pre-build, and then from kind of runs from the pre-build forward. So if you're like starting your workspace state forward, so rather than running the init commands, it then runs the actual regular command, assuming that the pre-build has already been ran, which allows you to then emulate sort of a workspace start based on a pre-build. But this is something that we're still exploring and experimenting with, the best way to kind of expose this to users and which different states that they would find useful as well. So hopefully that answered the question.
Yes, I think so. We have a couple of questions, I think, round two. So
let's go.
So, next question. Are new workspaces opening every time you run a GP rebuild, or is it all on the same workspace?
Yeah, so One sort of limitation with this approach, as it currently is it runs this kind of like, it's like a workspace in a workspace, which one of the repercussions of that is then it's using resources, space, and memory from your actual workspace. This might be something we change in the future. We might unify this. Potentially we offload the workspace, this start of this additional workspace back on Gitpod side, but that's something that we're thinking about for the future. Current present day implementation, it actually starts it within your workspace. And then when you run the rebuild command, it actually just creates a single workspace, a single URL, which if I go to it over here now, let's try this actually. I think if I run this now, so yeah, you'll get a disconnect because it's basically stopped that workspace, it doesn't exist. But then a typical flow, so this should work as well. If you just reload on that one, it's going to reload with a new configuration. So it's up to you, kind of, we've been experimenting with different setups here about how to get this flow of this additional workspace and how to get that right in terms of user perspective, but that's how it works currently. It just creates one, and every time you keep running rebuild, it will just create that new workspace for you again that exists at the same URL. So it's up to you. You can just refresh that tab as well, or if you're using it on SSH, you could same thing.
Nice. Okay, I hope that answered your question. If not, feel free to add more comments in the chat. So the next question is again from Sky. I noticed the notes about rebuild mention the command being as close as possible. I forget exact wording. To manually starting a new workspace. What are the current differences between a new instance and running rebuild?
It's a good question. So we're still going through testing with this to try and find out all the different edge cases for it. I think it's quite lifelike. One thing that we know, a couple of things, I think there are some aspects of Docker currently that we have some differences using Docker and Docker images with inside your workspace, which I believe we have fixes for that are coming soon, but I'd have to double check. Some other stuff, I think doc file support is not there just yet. But as far as I understand, I think we can get this to very, very close to just a full parity really with the existing workspace start process. So I think it's in many ways it's quite close already. You know, there's things that I didn't show you here, but you know, we have like the sort of the task integration, the ports appear. If you set a port to open with a preview and open a new tab, all of that stuff happens exactly the same as it does today. So in many ways already it's quite similar, but obviously the closer you get to sort of the fringe things, you start to do interesting stuff as well. That's where potentially it gets interesting, and we would love for you to try it out and see if there are scenarios or use cases that we can't cover. I'm just trying to think if there are others that come to mind just yet that we've found so far. But I'm not sure. But these are all things that we'll have to tackle before general availability as well. So this is kind of like an early-ish preview of the feature, but we're still trying to figure out which aspects don't achieve parity right now. But depending on how, it really depends, I think, on what you're trying to do. But a lot of the core things is already covered, and then some of the additional stuff we're looking to add in now as well.
Awesome. Cool. We have another question. How does it affect billing? I would assume it doesn't since it's running in the same workspace.
Yeah, so it shouldn't affect billing at all because the billing's then based on the workspace classes and the minutes, the consumption that you're using. So there should be no impact.
Cool.
Go
on.
One thing that we have been thinking about as well, it might make sense to run a larger workspace class whilst you're going through some of these cycles configuring. That's something we might add as a tip to the documentation when we go live with this, but we will see. But it depends on the size of the application you're trying to build.
Cool. Another question, is the updated Gitpod YAML file need to be committed from debug-workspace or from the main workspace? Great question.
Good question. It's covering topics that now it's bringing other ideas to mind as well. So one slight quirk about the design that has come up when we've gone through it with users, actually it shares the file system, which in some ways can be a bit interesting and quirky, but then in some ways has its own benefits as well. So, it's not just the Gitpod YAML that typically users are configuring, it's also files outside of that. So what we do is we actually then, that file system is then mounted into the debug workspace, and actually you're operating on the same file system. So actually I can show you that. It can be a little bit confusing at first, because theoretically you can actually also update files. Let's say if I go through a cycle with GP rebuild, and now I update, let's say the command inside this new workspace that's created. I don't know, let me add some comments in here. Let me just close this third tab so the context is easier to follow. So if I go ahead and add that in here, you're going to see as well that actually reflects back also in the original workspace. Now, yeah, that's just something, one of the trade-offs with the design and how it works. But what's kind of interesting about that as well is we saw before in my actual workspace, I didn't have npm installed. And this is one thing that's kind of interesting about the design is, well, if you don't have npm in that workspace, well, then you actually will in the other one, which is actually kind of useful if you want to, let's say you've installed a tool and then you want to just test, okay, well, does this, let me add these commands or this kind of flag just to test if it works. I'm getting quite a lot of latency on this as well. Hold on. Let me restart it. Oh, did I? Bear with me. Start it again. But what I was going to say is then, because you're almost running within the workspace, you can then use those tools that you've already configured also in the actual original workspace. So if I go over here and check npm, well, then npm actually exists because we've installed it. So there are some perks as well of that design, but it's just one thing to consider, that the file system is actually shared. But it's one thing
to clarify that part. When you install npm only when you're testing GP rebuild, it would be in the debug workspace, but it will not be in the main initial workspace. Is that correct?
Precisely. Yes. One thing that we didn't get to as well is, because this is trying your configuration, then opening sort of a new workspace for it. But then if you're happy with that configuration and you wanted to apply that to your current workspace, that's the point where you use the typical cycle, which is you commit, get rid of that workspace, and then start a new one. Part of the reason for that as well is because there's like a bootstrapping process when a workspace is created, which means that, and we will actually look at this in future, ways to, you've got this state here, you've created that new workspace, and then a way to make a new workspace. Okay, I'm happy with this, to then just create a new workspace based on that and then start working directly inside that. That's not something that's currently supported, but something that we've been thinking about. But yes, the initial workspace won't have those tools, but then the sort of new workspace that you're creating will have those tools if you want to also experiment with them inside of it and then update your configuration with that as well. And it can be really, really quick then to make those changes.
Awesome. Hopefully that answered your question. I think this has already been answered in the chat, but I thought it's worth you answering as well, Lou, for everyone to hear, just in case they missed it. So similar to the pre-build flag, should there be a special flag for updating the image or gitpod.docker file of the project?
Gitpod.docker file. I'm not sure if I follow the question, actually. I'm not sure if that person...
Gitpod Docker file. I can explain the question. But if you go to the Gitpod Docker file where you can actually install things like npm or anything else, when you add things here, any update that happens here, it will be installed in the debug workspace.
Yes.
Without
exactly.
adding any flags, it just by itself does it.
No, yeah, exactly. Because the way Gitpod works is if you don't specify, it just uses workspace full. So it's semantically equivalent to just doing this. That's just sort of assumed for all workspaces, like you're just saying that I want to use the hosted version of workspace full, and then we use that. If the user specifies, then we use the one that they've specified. But yes, the Docker file is totally included with it as well. That was one of the big reasons to one of the big motivations actually behind the feature as well, to not just do the sort of the IDE stuff, the commands, the tasks, all of those integrations, but also all of the tooling and everything in the Docker file as well. So yeah, that's all included.
Okay.
Awesome. And I think there's another question. Does GP Rebuild have access to all secrets / environment variables of the project?
Yes, this is an interesting question. So one thing that we were looking at recently, and I'm not sure where this is at in current release status as well, is around project environment variables and reading project environment variables. So you have all of the access to the secrets and stuff for your user. That's all there, and you can use it, and that gets pulled through to the other workspace, and secrets and credentials all work as they would regularly. The one thing that's interesting is around project environment variables, because you can specify at a project level specific environment variables, which previously were mostly used in a pre-build, and that was for, let's say, secrets that you wanted to have contained across a project, but maybe you didn't want to share per person. Maybe you wanted to build your image, connect to an image repository or something like this, pull some specific things, but you didn't necessarily want that access to be granted then to your specific users. So that's one thing that we're looking at right now as well, to also add project level environment variable support. Again, I'd have to double check where that's at in terms of release cycle, where we're at with that. But I'm not aware of other constraints just yet, because you've got all of the user level stuff, the project level stuff we are working on as well, so that can potentially be included in there also. But it's a good question, and if we find anything else, I'll let you know.
I guess also would be don't do it now because it might do stuff, but using like a print env in both environment and see that they're the same.
Oh yes, I won't do that and print out all my environment
Yeah,
variables.
do that. Yeah.
Yes, you could totally do that after the call if you want to go and try it. Yeah, that was I originally was going to go through that in the demo, but yeah, I was concerned that maybe we would spend a bit too much time. But yeah, it should work.
You can try do something gpn foobar and then run it, and run gpn in debug to show that it picks up everything.
That is a good idea.
Yeah, and now if you start it, you should have that thing.
But if I run GPM, it's just going to print out all my environment variables now.
You don't do gpn, you can do just env foo.
Okay.
Not gpn, env. Because it was applied already. Just env without gp. So remove gp.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Yeah, there you go. I hope that answers the question.
Awesome. Hopefully that answered the question, Shal. There is another question. If I delete or modify files in /workspace inside debug workspace, will they get deleted also in the main workspace?
Yes. Yeah, because it's a shared file system. I can show you that, because just as the same as modifying files, it's the same. So if I go in here and I don't know, if I delete my README, that's going to reflect through. So let me delete my README file, let's say, from inside that workspace, and then I go back. The README file is also gone from here as well. If I run through that, yeah.
Nice. I think we've gone through all of the questions, unless there's any more questions coming up. Oh, there's another question. Is there a way to test URL parameters in GP Rebuild?
That's a good question.
The use case is in DrupalPod, for example, using a lot of URL params, but really it's about the Gitpod YAML tasks that are run differently according to these parameters.
I don't think it's supported right now.
No, No,
But we
I was
could have
thinking
something like env options, for example, gp reveal --env.
Mhm.
That's it.
Good question. I'm not quite sure. I'd have to have a look. That might be to add it to the support list. Yeah, I'm thinking because the regular GP rebuild doesn't respect. It's just building like a vanilla no URL param version of the workspace. It's a good question. Very good question. I like that one. I will have a look into it and we'll get back to you.
Awesome.
So
Cool.
if you want, Pauline, I've got a couple other slides to run through, which I think we covered a little bit. But then if there's other questions as well, we can answer those as well. I'm happy to jump back into if
No.
jogs any
Yeah.
thoughts as well.
Yeah, no. Now, so go ahead.
For sure. So one thing I was going to say, so implementation wise, this runs within your existing workspace. I think I mentioned this. So some of you might have the question, why not rebuild the actual workspace? Well, there's some trade-offs here. So I didn't show this as well, but when you run that first rebuild, it will have to pull your sort of Docker images. So if you've got a massive Docker image, it's going to take a little bit of time on that first run. But then the second and subsequent runs are then immediately much faster. Now, there's a lot of interplay now between this sort of way of rebuilding a workspace and a full workspace build. Because now once you've created that, as we said, you might then want to then go ahead and create a workspace, and we're thinking about ways that we can enable that for you. But there's a little bit of sharing that needs to happen there. Let's say from today, if you run this flow and then you go and start a workspace, well, those caches are not shared. So then if you have to do a regular workspace build, it will have to run through all the caching again. But then we're discussing and having thoughts about how could we unify that? How could we make that quicker? But ultimately, the thing is, this should cover so many use cases now that in most scenarios, you shouldn't need to do the regular sort of commit flow itself. So this should be very much like you get very close to happy with it, and then that commit and then test at the end is really just like a final check just to check if everything's working. But then it should be as close to parity already from previously running this command. But as I mentioned before, some of the downsides or the challenges is it uses the resources in the workspace, which can be challenging if you've got a really big project. And another big thing that's been interesting for us is about mental models, because this idea of sort of rebuilding your current workspace is something it's kind of a new flow to a lot of users. There's not a mental model that you can really hang your hat on here. This is kind of like a semi-new thing. There's maybe analogous like kind of flows that you might have. To me, this feels, I don't know, I feel like a bit of a web developer here. I'm kind of like rebuilding things and then trying them out in sort of like trying out my changes in a tab or in the browser, which feels a little bit like that. But we were very curious also to get your feedback on how it feels and the ergonomics of it as well, and just then try and iterate and improve as well on that experience, because it's quite an atypical sort of developer experience or UX flow. So we're very curious to see how the adoption is, how people like it, and any issues they run into. I think I've got maybe one or two more slides. So yes, so something also that we're working on right now is just improving visibility of this feature for new users. As the feature progresses towards sort of a GA release later, we will sort of push this more to new users, suggesting this as a way to use it. But for existing users, they certainly won't necessarily know that this exists. So we've been looking at ways that we can sort of raise and elevate it within the product so that it's more obvious that this functionality exists, so that you can run it more easily. So here's just some examples of different VS Code integrations that we've been experimenting with. So you can right-click the Gitpod YAML, and you've got the command there directly in your right-click command. We've got the sort of the code lens stuff, so you can click validate directly from the Docker file, potentially adding a run button as well into VS Code, so you can rerun stuff, and also providing notifications. So potentially when you update that configuration, that then Gitpod's going to say, hey, do you want to validate this as well? And just trying to make it easier for you to go through those flows when you're updating the configuration and getting that feedback without having to go through sort of a clunky additional flow to start a new workspace. but yes, I've alluded to this a little bit already anyway, but in terms of what's next, oops, let me just cancel some of these notifications. In terms of what's next, so basically we will look at improving what we call like this outer loop. So this actual regular workspace start and the interconnection between this command and how you regularly start a workspace. I've just mentioned it, but also helping users to find this feature is also something that we're trying to do a lot more. And also as well, like linting. This presents a really interesting opportunity for Gitpod now because we can provide users with much faster feedback. You know, if they misspell their Gitpod YAML, then we can tell them sooner rather than later. If they have done something wrong, for instance, now there are a couple of requirements even for workspace images that you need. So if you don't add Git into your workspace image, you're going to get an error when you start that workspace. But then what we can do now, and we do this already actually, is we validate that. So if you don't add some of these prerequisites to your image, rather than starting a workspace and getting an error message, you'll get that feedback to you much quicker than you previously did. And we're looking to explore that and build that out more, because you've got not just the rebuilding of workspaces here, but you have like linting, nudges towards best practices, you know, smaller Docker images, performance improvements, maybe features that users aren't aware of within Gitpod, because there's quite a lot that potentially some users are overlooking. So this is an opportunity for us to present those and put those in front of users to kind of improve that configuration experience for them as well. And yes, the last thing I think, I had in here was also about the naming. So I alluded to this a bit before, but we are an open source company. So if you want to, you're very welcome to come and join the discussion here. We've been discussing some different permutations and options for the naming of this command and the flags and the options that are passed in. So if you want to come and discuss that with us, you're very welcome. The issue ID is 16389. But maybe hopefully someone can share it in the chat. If not, I'll share it in Discord after. Certainly, so if during this you were thinking, it'd be really cool if this was named this, or if there were different flags, or if flags were named in a specific way, or if you had thoughts on that, we're very keen to hear your opinion there as well. But I think that's it in terms of the formal presentation. So, yeah.
That was awesome, Lou. Thank you. Thank you so much. We only have 4 minutes left, and there's 2 questions, which I think we should close with. So the first question is perhaps half related. Is devcontainer.json support coming soon, and will it work with GP rebuild? That wasn't just the question, but you know.
Okay. I mean, today was not really about dev container. I think I put a comment on that issue quite recently. It's something dev container stuff we've talked about internally quite a bit. There's no official sort of update or statement we can share at this point regarding sort of support on what we're doing, but we're constantly thinking about it and discussing it and trying to find the potential best way to integrate. Like, the thing to consider is from a product design philosophy, we want to integrate as best as possible with all the different tools that people are using, and that doesn't exclude dev container as well. So we're kind of looking at that, but I don't have official answers for dev container. Hopefully, maybe in future we can do a community session where maybe there's sort of more updates that we can provide.
That would be awesome. Will it work with a GP rebuild was the additional part of that question, but I guess we can discuss that in a future session. Final question: what does this GP rebuild look like when developing within a local editor? Which I found that a very interesting question.
Yeah, it's a good question. So that's something also that we're playing with right now to find the right experience for it. So currently it just emits the URL. So so you've actually got the SSH connection as well. So you can do this with multiple terminals if you wanted to. But then on the desktop editors, either you need to go through the SSH flow or open in the browser. But that's something that we're also looking at and trying to refine. So there's no straightforward answers I have to that just yet, but it's something that we're looking at and improving as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Lou. Wow, we actually took the full hour this week. And I think that's a good testament to an awesome demo and all of the amazing questions. So thank you so much, community, for hanging out with us this hour. And as Mike just posted in the chat, super awesome feedback. I'm sure the IDE team will have lots to work with in the next few weeks. So I just wanted to say a couple of things. So that's it for today. If you do want to watch this replay, it will be up on our YouTube channel. And just a few community callouts. First one is if you want to present in our future community office hours, let me know. We have 2 slots left for this quarter. And our next one that we've got confirmed is happening in March 22nd with our community heroes who will be doing a Raycast demo. I'll just leave it at there because there's loads of cool, exciting things that they will showcase. And so if you're interested in that, let me know. The second thing is if you are interested in hosting an in-person community meetup, we have several happening across the world, happening in France, potentially Estonia, potentially definitely Amsterdam, and they're kicking off right now. So if you want to get involved, let us know. Awesome. That's it for today's session. Thank you again for hanging out, everyone, and we'll see you on Discord.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, folks. Speak to you
Thanks.
soon. Ciao.